Welcome to this special edition of the World Trade Webcast. I'm Greg Sandler, president of thinkglobal.com, the B2B network for global trade leads. This week on the World Trade Webcast, we're focusing on the battle over reauthorization of the Export-Import Bank of the United States. This week, we'll focus on the argument against reauthorization. Last week, we discussed the argument for reauthorization. Our guest today is Diane Katz, Research Fellow in Regulatory Policy at the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank based in Washington, D.C. Diane, welcome to the World Trade Webcast.
Thank you, Greg. Happy to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have someone with your expertise joining us today. And to set the stage for our discussion, let me give our viewers just a little bit of historical perspective. The Export-Import Bank of the United States, an independent U.S. government agency, is facing a reauthorization battle on Capitol Hill. The Export-Import Bank of the United States is the official export credit agency of the United States. It's an independent, self-sustaining agency that provides financing for the export of American goods and services. The ExIm Bank was reauthorized in September 2014, and the bank's current charter expires on June 30th, 2015. So to get things started, Diane, can you provide us with some background and context about this reauthorization battle?
Sure. Just as a technical point, the bank wasn't necessarily reauthorized in September. Its current charter was extended because the Congress was unable to come to an agreement on whether or not to reauthorize. Now, the current battle is basically about those who think that the ExIm Bank should continue as it is for another 5 years, and those who believe, as I do, that ExIm is an unnecessary and risky, endeavor that just is a relic of the Depression era and that we just don't need.
Certainly, and thank you for that clarification as well. So proponents argue that ExIm reauthorization will support jobs growth and economic development, and you've argued, as have others, that the bank simply extrapolates job claims data and really has no idea how many jobs are supported. So one of the questions is, does the ExIm Bank really benefit the economy?
Well, I would say, no. One thing to understand about ExIm is that it only benefits about 1.5% to 2% of all exports every year. So that means between 98 and 98.5% of exports are all done with private capital. So in that respect, it shows that there is absolutely no shortage of private capital. Now, when it comes to jobs, whether they create jobs, officials of ExIm will point to various schemes that they have financed overseas where there may be jobs related to, the production of the goods that are sold overseas. But that's only half the equation. The other part of the equation has to do with the effect that those subsidies have on companies in the U.S. who are not getting the subsidies. And we know, from a variety of sources that there are many industries that are hurt by ExIm subsidizing foreign competitors. Things like coal mining in Colombia, copper mining in Mexico, airline sales around the world to airlines that compete with U.S. airlines. And so taken all together, I don't think that it can be, logically said that ExIm creates jobs or benefits the economy. And then one further point. The management at ExIm does not keep actual statistics on jobs created by their financing. As you mentioned, what they do is they look at national figures and they look at the dollar and jobs that are related to exports, and they extrapolate from that number the likely number of jobs that are created. But we don't really know how many jobs are created. And then even if jobs are created, I would still say that ExIm is not, an appropriate role for government to play because it distorts the economy and it distorts labor. So basically what it's doing in instances, if it does create jobs or if it does generate revenue for the Treasury. It's simply moving those resources around. It's not creating new resources by any means.
Excellent points. And let's focus a little bit more on sort of the small business, corporate business discussion. The ExIm Bank officials, as well as proponents for reauthorization, argue that 90% of ExIm Bank's transactions benefit small businesses. And of course, opponents are pointing to the help that companies such as Boeing and Caterpillar and others receive as corporate welfare. So I guess the question is, what are the benefits, if any, to small businesses? And even if there aren't direct benefits to small businesses, isn't there a beneficial trickle-down effect from supporting big U.S. corporations with this kind of assistance?
Okay, so the first place to start with this, because this is a big issue in the debate, the first place to start is to understand what ExIm considers to be a small business. And under its definition of small business, a company can have up to 1,500 employees, or it can have revenues exceeding $21 million a year. Now, to my mind, that's not exactly small. But in any event, those are the businesses that they're counting. And when they say 90% of transactions, what they're referring to are the actual number of cases, or, it is a transaction. It's basically the paperwork. What is the more important figure is how much of the money goes to small business. And in most cases, it's less than 20% per year. And so the vast majority of the funding, some 75%, even up to 80% of ExIm financing, benefits just about 10 multinational corporations. And now in terms of, trickle down, you can say that a company like Boeing, which is ExIm's, collects the most benefit from ExIm. It has suppliers, and some of those suppliers are small businesses. And so therefore, if Boeing gets lots of help from ExIm, that helps, the Boeing contractors. Well, what about the Delta contractors? Because those are the people who are going to be hurt when Delta can't compete with foreign airlines on international routes, because the other, in some cases, government-owned airlines in India or, anywhere around the globe are saving, upwards of, 150 million, or 15 million per plane because of ExIm.
Yeah, and I think that raises a really interesting question, and you alluded to it earlier, which is, how does ExIm's activities overseas come back and affect domestic industries in the U.S.? Of course, one of the arguments for reauthorization is that it helps U.S. exporters compete, and then at the same time, proponents point to the fact that other countries provide substantial support for their exporters. As you know, at least 59 other countries around the world have foreign export credit agencies. So the question, I guess, there is, won't eliminating the bank ultimately put the U.S. At a competitive disadvantage because all these other countries are in fact providing similar help to their companies?
Well, that's a reasonable question. So a couple points. One, it's important to remember, again, that 98% of U.S. exports are not financed or helped in any way by the ExIm Bank. And so it's very unlikely that America would see an appreciable effect on its export activity in the event that we didn't have ExIm. But aside from that, it also, let me just add on to that. It also indicates that there's no shortage of private capital for exports. Additionally, the cost of financing is only one factor in these types of, large, for example, construction projects. Let's say you're building, a huge electricity transmission network, or a power plant. I mean, the cost of financing is one small piece. There are also the factors about the ability to deliver, the value and the quality of the products that are delivered. Those matter as well. And finally, every country has its own unique advantages. And the United States, perhaps, is the country that has the greatest number of advantages. And so I wouldn't put, Export-Import Bank among those many, many advantages, because obviously everybody's got them. And so there are things that the United States can do, however, that are very unique to the United States. And for that matter, they make for excellent exports, which is borne out by the fact that we're hitting record levels in exporting.
Very good. And then let's also talk for a second about the fact that ExIm provides financing for U.S. customers abroad that would not otherwise have access to capital. So what's your view on this? Does it? I think you've, to a certain extent, you've already touched on this, but does it make sense for the federal government to provide financing to importers of U.S. product or buyers that might otherwise not be able to get that kind of credit from the commercial marketplace?
I'm not at all convinced that, in fact, a lot of the beneficiaries of ExIm are unable to get capital from elsewhere. There have been a number of instances where that's been shown not to be true. But it raises a question, and it should raise taxpayers' curiosity, because we're the ones who will be on the hook for the, any and all losses that ExIm, acquires. If a particular transaction or a financing deal is too risky for the private sector to take on, why does that merit then taxpayers taking that on? And, given the level of exports that we have in the United States and the fact that they're growing, and again, the fact that 98% of them benefit from private financing, I just don't buy that there's financing that, would hurt the U.S. if it wasn't available.
I think those are excellent points. And so let's talk for a minute about how much actual exposure the government has. Certainly one report that you wrote recently puts the real exposure at $134 billion and suggests, as you just did, that's too much risk for taxpayers.
Well, actually, the GAO at this point now puts the total exposure, it's called, at over 140 billion, which is the cap. And because ExIm's accounting systems are weak, we don't know exactly what the total exposure is. One of the reasons that the proponents will say that, we don't have to worry about taxpayers being on the hook is because our default rates are low. What they fail to mention, however, is that they have a very, very narrow definition of what constitutes a default. So, for example, if they have a company that's not repaying on a loan, they may keep it on the books, for years in some cases, rather than call it a default. And so we don't have an accurate picture of how much default there actually is. We do know that in the 80s, for example, ExIm racked up losses of exceeding $5 billion. So it's also important here to recognize that I want to point to Fannie and Freddie, for example. For years and years, we heard of how profitable they were and how they benefited the Treasury and so on and so on. And in fact, they were great until they weren't. And then it landed in taxpayers' laps. And so I'm not willing to take the risk, $140 billion risk with ExIm, when in fact it's completely unnecessary.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. And I think also what's interesting about this debate is that it's created some unusual alliances in the battle over reauthorization. So on the one hand, we've got groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers who are advocating for reauthorization. And then on the other hand, we've got groups such as your own, the Heritage Foundation, and then Public Citizen, a liberal advocacy group, who are in agreement really in calling for an end to the bank. Can you give us your insight into what's driving these alliances? Sure.
They are strange alliances. I mean, when you have, someone like Maxine Waters, who is, a devotee of Fidel Castro, in the same, bed, so to speak, with the Chamber of Commerce, it's kind of an unusual, an unusual deal. But when you think about it, it makes some sense, because what we have is we have interests that are pro-business on one hand and interests that are anti-conservative on the other hand, getting together and trying to continue a cronyist program that benefits both of their districts, their constituents. What we have on the side of the opponents, however, are those who believe in free enterprise, which is much different than pro-business. And so in a free enterprise system, you don't have government involved in financing projects. You don't have government, actually, determining who gets what money for what types of exports. And so I think the big distinction is between those of us who are free enterprise versus those who are big government, pro-business.
Excellent. Yeah, I think you did a very good job of characterizing those alliances. So finally, if you could get your crystal ball out for us, if reauthorization were put to a vote today, what do you think the outcome will be? And looking down the road, when it really is put to a vote, what is your projection on what will happen?
Greg, I never guess juries or Congress. There's just no way to know. I will tell you that I'm going to do everything in my power over the next few months to, make sure that ExIm is not reauthorized. But and what I want from Congress is a showing that, in fact, they recognize, that this is a cronyist enterprise and that people are basically fed up with cronyism. And then on the Republican end, I want Republicans and conservatives to understand that, they cannot demand reform to social welfare programs if they're not willing to give up business welfare programs. And so that's why this is such an important issue. It's a small agency. Most people have never heard of it, but it's symbolic. It's hugely symbolic. And it's a good place to start because it's small and it's doable and will have very little effect on the economy, if any effect whatsoever. And so for those reasons, I can only hope that they don't reauthorize. But change here is really, really tough, and especially change that involves, subsidies and cronyism. And, I've got mine. So much for you.
And I think certainly we'll see how this plays out now over the next 6 months as both sides step up their advocacy for one side or the other of the issue. So we're out of time today, but we've been talking with Diane Katz from the Heritage Foundation about the reauthorization of the ExIm Bank. And Diane, thank you again for joining us today.
My pleasure.
It's been great having you. And for those of you that are interested in more information, you can go to the Heritage Foundation's website. And if you're interested in more information about the World Trade webcast or to subscribe to the webcast, you can use any of the links below. So we'll look forward to seeing you all again next week with the next episode of the World Trade webcast. And again, thanks for watching.